All right, here we go. We are starting another Greek class, and before we get going, we will ask Stacy if you would open us in prayer.
Thank you, Heavenly Father, that Dr. Stanley is available to teach this class. Father, thank you for your grace. Thank you for the presence of your Spirit. Thank you for the joy of learning. Father, for the good fruit that will be born and come forth in our lives to share with others, Father. We invite your presence. We invite your wisdom in each student, Father, and especially anoint our teacher, bless him, strengthen him, Father, to teach us with joy, and let there be a reward for him for having traveled the furthest. Father, we ask traveling mercies on him and a good blessing of fellowship and class time tonight. In Jesus' name, we pray.
Amen. Thank you. All right. Tonight we're going to cover two of the big topics: infinitives and participles. How did you find it when you read through this? Did you find it all right? Did you understand it?
Well, I begin to understand the participles where if it's a present participle, you go as we were doing something. If it was a past aorist participle after we did something. So it started to yell a little bit.
Good. That's very good. Well, as he points out, the participle is probably the hardest part for us, at least English speakers, and probably most other people, to understand and really get down. My beginning Greek professor, that was several months ago now, called the participle the Waterloo of beginning Greek. You know, you either were going to cut it or you weren't. You know, and but we understand the participle. We're past that Waterloo, but here we get into the more complex nuances of the participle. But first we tackle the infinitive. So if you're looking on page 255 of your text, by the way, are you finding it easier to read this text now? Hopefully you will. There's a phenomenon that happens. You're finding it easier to read the book of Mark now. As you read in the book of Mark, you begin to pick up stylistic things. You begin to pick up even the vocabulary particular to Mark, and it becomes easier. Hopefully the same thing is happening as you read this syntax book, because it's not exactly in our language, is it? So maybe we pick up some things, and once you look up a word or two in the dictionary, it might help you. All right, so the infinitive, top of page 255, definition and basic characteristics. We've said this before in beginning Greek. The infinitive is an indeclinable verbal noun. Infinitive, a verbal noun. As such, it participates in some of the features of the verb and some of the noun. Like a verb, infinitive has tense and voice, but not person or mood. It can take an object and be modified by adverbs. Its number is always singular, like the oblique moods, non-indicative moods. The infinitive is normally negated by may rather than oo. That's how infinitives are like verbs. Like a noun, the infinitive can have many of the case functions that an ordinary noun can have: subject, object, apposition. It can function as the object of a preposition, be anarthrous and articular. What do those words mean, anarthrous and articular?
And anarthrous is without a definite article.
Without a definite article and with a definite article. And be modified by an adjective. Although technically infinitives do not have gender, often the neuter singular article is attached to them. So from a structural perspective, it would be appropriate to speak of infinitives as neuter, though this is never part of the parsing. The neuter article really has no other significance than a formal attachment, though the case of the article at times may be important to observe. So you don't really have to ask yourself, what use of the article is this? It's just the use of the article with an infinitive. One ought not to read into a given infinitive any impersonal idea simply because a neuter article is used! Exclamation point. That would be an abuse of the infinitive, wouldn't it? All right. You read about the infinitive occurring after prepositions, and when it does, the infinitive is always articular. So, as you can imagine, sometimes the verbal part of the infinitive, I want to say the verbal aspect of the infinitive, but I don't want you to confuse that with the grammatical term aspect. The verbal nature of the infinitive is in the forefront. Sometimes the noun or substantival aspect of the infinitive is in the forefront. Kind of go either way. Same will be true with the participle when we see that. All right. Semantic categories. You can see a chart on the top of page 256. And you can see that sometimes the infinitive is used independently, sometimes dependently. Normally, if you have a verbal infinitive, that is where the verb part of the infinitive is in the fore, it's going to be dependent. And you may have a nominal, or where the noun part of the infinitive is in the fore, you may have either one of those. But that probably tends to be more independent. All right, so adverbial uses of the infinitive. Now, right away, when we talk about adverbial uses of the infinitive, what does that designation tell you?
Modifying the verb.
All right. Yeah, so it's basically going to be in the function of modifying a verb. So, first of all, you have an infinitive of purpose. And you can just, normally when you see an infinitive, you can translate it with the English word to something. And that translation fits perfectly the idea of purpose. I came to speak about Greek. My purpose is but you can also, in other words, like in order to or for the purpose of. That's fairly straightforward, but notice there are various structures, and he makes a distinction here between structural issues in relation to infinitives and other parts of speech, and semantics. Semantics would be the meaning carried by the word. Structure has to do with the way the sentence is structured around it. In other words, does it have an article or something else like that, right? And so here are some structural issues related to a purpose infinitive. You may have a purpose infinitive that's simply a naked infinitive. Without anything, just an infinitive right there. That's possible. Or you could have to plus the infinitive. That is the genitive case, isn't it? What gender would it be? Neuter, because he says that the articles that go with an infinitive are always neuter. So that's a neuter genitive singular article, and he also said infinitives are always singular. Ace ta with the infinitive, that's a great marker of a purpose infinitive, and even pros ta plus the infinitive. Unto this or toward this. The idea of purpose. Secondly, you can have a result infinitive, and if you look down, you can see the structural markers of the result infinitive, which are, again, the simple infinitive without anything with it, to plus the infinitive, ace ta plus the infinitive, which is all the same as the purpose infinitive, but the last one is different. Hoste plus the infinitive would be a result marker. Now, this little sentence after those structural markers we looked at is important. Note that the first three parallel the first three structural patterns of the purpose infinitive, making syntactical decisions sometimes difficult. And not only that, the distinction between purpose and result is sometimes hard to ferret out, isn't it? Right? Why? Because if you purpose something, there is a pretty good chance that it's going to happen and therefore be a result. If something happens, there's a chance that it happened on purpose. So is it purpose or result? Many times it's both. It's both purposed and it's the result that's purposed. Right? Sometimes it's clear that it's the purpose. Sometimes it's clear that it's the result. But when you talk about purpose or result, infinitives, or even participles, it's very difficult sometimes to distinguish the two, and sometimes maybe you should not distinguish between the two. If the class were over and I said, all right, I came to talk about Greek, would that be purpose or result? Well, it turns out to be both, doesn't it? Maybe it's more purpose than result, but the purpose was accomplished, so...
We need some context.
Well, you do. Yeah, you have to have some context. All right. Now, infinitive of purpose, infinitive of result, infinitive of time. And even though there is a footnote on this explaining it, I still think it's rather goofy, and I don't blame this on Wallace necessarily, but the way they designate these is kind of funny. Just try to remember that it's backwards. An infinitive can indicate antecedent action of the main verb. So meta, ta, plus the infinitive means after whatever, after speaking. And you continue on. I mean, it's almost used like a participle would be used, isn't it? Very similar. Contemporaneous action, ento, with the infinitive. A great example of the parable of the sower. Ento speirain, in the sowing. Well, that's contemporaneous action of the main verb, while he was sowing. And then you have subsequent action with pra, to, or prin a, plus the infinitive. And you would translate that before. Now the thing that's goofy about this is that it's not the action of the infinitive that's antecedent, it's the action of the main verb that's antecedent to the infinitive. Now in the contemporaneous one, that's not confusing because they're both happening at the same time. In the subsequent designation, it's not the action of the infinitive that's subsequent, but it's the action of the main verb that's subsequent to the action of the infinitive. The thing I find strange about this designation is that if we're talking about infinitives, and we're going to say this is an infinitive of antecedent time, why aren't we talking about the action of the infinitive? Well, maybe I'm just letting my ignorance show here. I don't know. But it seems like we're talking about an infinitive of antecedent time. Shouldn't the action of the infinitive be antecedent to that of the main verb? But that's not how we have it designated. Now he says that some grammars get this backwards, and they call the antecedent the subsequent and the subsequent the antecedent. Maybe they do it out of ignorance, but my bet is they do it out of clarity.
This was confusing to me when I read it.
Yeah.
I can understand it easier the way you just said it.
Yeah. Well, it's goofy. If you had a participle, if you're going to have a participle that is antecedent, that the action of the participle is antecedent to the main verb. We're talking about the action of the infinitive here, so I don't know these designations. I guess I'm not smart enough to figure out why they do it this way, but it is backwards. So when you think of the antecedent infinitive of time, it is actually the main verb whose action is antecedent to the action of the infinitive. I think those should be swapped around just for clarity, but that's just me. All right. But you can see how that works, and it's fairly straightforward except for that confusion. You also have an infinitive of cause, which is somewhat straightforward, and the marker for that is dia ta with the infinitive, and that's not hard to figure out. On account of to not have a root, it withered, literally, right? On account of to not have a root, because it had no root is a good English translation of that very, cumbersome and clumsy literal translation. If you can give something a very literal translation, even though it comes out very clumsy, a lot of times it will give you the sense of what you're talking about, and then you can take that and put it into good English, try to get that across. So very often that's the case. So the infinitive of cause, the complementary infinitive is simply an infinitive that goes with a verb. It kind of is a helper to a verb. And so various verbs, as we have already learned, require infinitives to complete them, like archemai, boulamai, dunamai, epitrepo, zeteo, thelo, melo, ophello. And so you just have an infinitive after that, right? I am beginning to. I am wanting to. I am able to. It's the same in English, isn't it? Right? I am able to. I am seeking to. I am about to. I ought to. So that's the complementary infinitive, just sort of working together with a verb that needs an infinitive, or at least can be completed by an infinitive. All right? So those are the adverbial uses of the infinitive. That's fairly straightforward. Now we have the substantival uses of the infinitive, and this is fairly straightforward too. An infinitive can be used as the subject of a sentence. To be here is good in his example. To know Greek is well worth the price. Right? So what's the subject of that sentence? To know Greek. To know is the infinitive. And it would work the same in English and Greek. And Greek is the direct object of the infinitive, which reminds us that infinitives can have direct objects. So what's the whole sentence? It's that infinitive phrase, to know Greek, and then the main verb of the sentence is worth, and that would be the predicate adjective, is worth the price. See how that works? So an infinitive can be used as a subject. Substantival uses, right? Infinitive, and this is now, we were talking about the verb side of the infinitive, now we're talking about the noun side of the infinitive, and we're finding that infinitives can be used in some slots that nouns can be used in. Remember how we talked about slots? You would expect a noun in this slot, you would expect a verb in this slot. Remember the poem we talked about, the Jabberwocky? The slithy tove did gyre and gimble in the wave. Well, there are actually some English morphemes in there, but a lot of those are just nonsense, but you can tell what slot they are, right? Just because of the order and some of the morphemes that go with it. We're talking about the slots that an infinitive can operate in. And when you have a substantival use of an infinitive, you might just have an article with it, see? When you have an adverbial use of an infinitive, you will not have an article with it. All right, so an infinitive can be used as a direct object. So those are the two main sort of substantival ways. Also in indirect discourse, he gives an English example in that bottom paragraph. I told you to do the dishes. That's an indirect quote of what would be a direct quote, like, do the dishes in the imperative. I told you to do the dishes. So you can see how an infinitive is used in a direct quote. Now, top of page 262, but consider the example. He claimed to know her. All right, in this sentence, the infinitive represents an indicative. He claimed, quote, I know her. So we had an example of an imperative. I told you to do the dishes. Here, this is not an imperative. He claimed to know her. So from these two illustrations, we can see some of the sentence embedding and in infinitives of indirect discourse. See what he's talking about? The general principle for these infinitives is that the infinitive of indirect discourse retains the tense of the direct discourse and usually represents either an imperative or an indicative. So just keep that in mind. Appositional. An infinitive can be used in apposition. We know what that means, right? Defining, redefining something else. Very bottom of the page, this category is easy to confuse with the exegetical infinitive, which is the next category. The difference is that the exegetical infinitive explains the noun or adjective to which it is related, while explains that noun, while apposition defines it. This is to say, apposition differs from epexegesis in that an appositional infinitive is more substantival than adjectival. This subtle difference can be seen in another way. An epexegetical infinitive phrase cannot typically substitute for its antecedent, while the appositional infinitive phrase can. So it's like the difference between an adjective and a noun and apposition. Right? The good farmer. Now, good is not an apposition to farmer; it describes farmer. Right? But if I said the farmer Bill, then Bill is an apposition to farmer, isn't it? Because it's restating the farmer again. All right, so an infinitive used appositionally. An example: pure religion is this: to visit orphans and widows. See, so this is pure religion. To. Or another example: it has been granted to you for Christ's sake not only to believe, but also to suffer. So it has been granted. What is it? To believe and to suffer. Now the epexegetical use of the infinitive. The epexegetical infinitive clarifies, explains, or qualifies a noun or adjective. This use of the infinitive is usually bound by certain lexical features of the noun or adjective. That is, they normally are words indicating ability, authority, desire, freedom, hope, need, obligation, or readiness. The usage is fairly common. So, I have given you authority to tread. So that's a description of the authority, but it isn't the exact same thing as authority, right? Authority and to tread are not the same thing, but it describes what kind of authority it is. I've given you authority to tread, and she is free to be married. It's very similar to the complementary use of the infinitive in my mind. I am able to do something, only this is related to a noun or an adjective instead of completing a verb. See what I mean? So the epexegetical use of the infinitive. All right, so those are the syntactical categories that we have for the infinitive. Any questions about those? That's fairly straightforward, isn't it? Structural categories, we can have an anarthrous infinitive, just a simple infinitive. Could be purpose, result, complementary, subject, and these are categories that we've already seen, right? Some of those categories can be used as appearing with as an anarthrous infinitive. Then we have prin or prin a plus the infinitive. We talked about that already. Subsequent time. Hos plus the infinitive for purpose or result. Then we have hoste plus the infinitive for rarely purpose but usually result. Right? So now we're talking about the structure of the words around the infinitive. What can the infinitive be used with? And what's the significance syntactically of that, semantically? Articular infinitives without a governing preposition can be used in the nominative. And obviously if you have a nominative infinitive, it'd be the subject of the sentence, or rarely an apposition. Accusative, you're going to have an object in a sentence, an object of a verb, or an object of maybe a preposition, or it can be an apposition. Genitive infinitives can denote purpose, result, contemporaneous time, which is rare, cause, also rare, or epexegesis. It can also be an apposition. All right, with a governing preposition, and this is good to note, we already talked about this, dia, ta plus the infinitive, cause. On account of, to do something, right? Just to give a clumsy literal translation. ta with the infinitive, purpose, result, or exegesis, into this. So, it's almost the idea of, we entered into this for this purpose, right? You can almost see that with that preposition. Ento with the infinitive, in this. So there's a time issue there. So in this time, in the time of, for example, in the time of the sowing, while he sowed. Meta, after something happens. Prasta, purpose or result, toward this. So movement into or movement toward kind of automatically, in my mind at least, portrays the idea of purpose or result, doesn't it? That seems to make a lot of sense. And then miscellaneous prepositional uses, and he refers you to Burton's moods and tenses, which I did not read, but I have that, so I could read that. So if you want to know about that, let me know. Maybe I'll make a copy of that and give it to you. Okay, so there's the infinitive. That was fairly painless, no? Questions about the infinitive? Comments? Any testimonies about your experience with the infinitive or anything like that? All right, now the big one. That being the participle. Page 266. The difficulty with participles. It's often said that mastery of the syntax of participles is mastery of Greek syntax. Isn't that great? You all will be masters of Greek syntax. You should spread that word.
Can we get to be reading that?
Yes. You can. Why are participles so difficult to grasp? The reason is threefold. Usage. The participle can be used as a noun, adjective, adverb, or verb, and in any mood. Word order. Participles often thrown at the end of sentences, etc. Locating the main verb. Sometimes the main verb is far from the participle, is only implied or not even there at all. So the participle is difficult because it's so flexible and can be used in so many ways. So you just kind of, the participle is where you've got to kind of loosen your shoulders, right? And you got to feel it. You got to feel the participle, right? Sometimes you have to be the participle.
Where art and science come together.
It's where art and science come together. And seriously, it is where your innate language ability that we've talked about can help you. Now, it can lead you astray, too. So, if you have a little understanding of how the participle is used, that will help you. But you just kind of have to stay loose and say, what's happening here? And be educated in your looseness, right? Stay loose, but be educated in your looseness. So now, you have looseness, don't you? Right? So now we're going to educate your looseness. So nobody's uptight about the participle, am I right? Yeah. All right, so the participle is a verbal adjective. We said that an infinitive is a verbal noun. The participle is a verbal adjective. It is a declinable verbal adjective. You will notice that the infinitive is a non-declinable, indeclinable verbal noun. This is a declinable verbal adjective. And it is that declinable part that kills us because that means we have a lot of endings. But, that's what makes it so cool. So we'll put up with that. From its verbal nature, it derives tense and voice from its adjectival nature, gender, number, and case. Like the infinitive, the participle's verbal nature is normally seen in a dependent manner. That is, it is normally adverbial in a broad sense, rather than functioning independently as a verb. Its adjectival side is seen in both the substantival, independent, and adjectival, dependent uses. Both are frequent, though the substantival is far more so. So what we're saying is, for both the infinitive and the participle, if you're using it in a verbal type of sense, it's probably going to be dependent on a main verb. Like, I want to do something. That would be an example. When you see the noun part, or the adjective part of, respectively, the infinitive and the participle, it can be used either way. It can be used to modify a substantive, or it can be used as a substantive itself. Just like an adjective, right? An adjective can be used both of those ways. So simply functioning as an adjective would function. Does that make sense to you? So he's charted this here. The verbal side of the participle time. The time of the participle's verbal nature requires careful consideration. Generally speaking, the tenses behave as they do in the indicative. The only difference is that now the point of reference is the controlling verb, not the speaker. Thus, time in participles is relative. We talked about this, didn't we? Or dependent, while the indicative is absolute or independent. When we talked about tenses, we talked about this. And indicative, we're talking about time relative to the speaker, a real issue of past, present, and future time. With a participle, we're talking about past, present, and future time, but in relation to the main verb. See? So I could do something participially in an action kind of way that is future with a past main verb, and the participle action comes after the main verb, but it's all in the past, right? So I can have a future participle describing an action that happened in the past. Do you see how that can happen? Right? So he gives you this chart here, absolute time in the indicative mood and relative time in the participle. Past, aorist, perfect, imperfect, pluperfect for the indicative, aorist and perfect participles. Present, I'm betting he means present instead of perfect there, right? Because we don't have any.
I hope so.
We don't have any.
Figure that one out.
We don't have any presents here in this chart, which is odd because there are present indicatives if my memory serves me, and there are present participles if my memory serves me. So it would be odd that it gets messed. So I think this is a typo. That should be present in both of those, and then future, of course, future indicative and future participle. All right, paragraph under that. The aorist participle, for example, usually denotes antecedent time to that of the controlling verb. Now see here, we're talking about participle action. We're talking about the action of the participle being antecedent. Why can't we do the same thing with the infinitive and make it simple? That's all I want. Right? Or if I make a big deal of it, you'll remember it's backwards, right? The thing of it is, if you made it simple, everybody would want to be a pastor, right? And that's not good.
Right.
Huh?
Armchair theologian.
Armchair theologians, We don't need the competition. Boy, it's not even late yet. All right, continuing on. But if the main verb is also aorist, the participle may indicate contemporaneous time. The perfect participle also indicates antecedent time. The present participle is used for contemporaneous time. This contemporaneity, how do you say that? Contemporaneity, however, is often quite broadly conceived, depending especially on the tense of the main verb. The future participle denotes subsequent time. Now, participles can be pushed off of this, right? Because what if you want to indicate a participial action that is concurrent with the main verb, but you want to indicate that you want to speak of it as this undefined or aoristic kind of action? So if the context makes it clear, you could use an aorist participle to indicate something that is time concurrent to the main verb, right? And the context will make that clear, but you'll know that the action is described as aoristic. See? Or what if you wanted to indicate a participle action after the main verb that was derivative? See, the future participle would be aoristic in its aspect, isn't it? And if you wanted to indicate derivative action after the main verb, you might use a present, but the context would have to indicate to you that that action would have to be after the main verb. So, you can break the rules if the context is strong enough to push it in that direction. If you want to say something that, just the options we have won't let you say. Okay? There are some things you can't say by sticking with the options given to us here with a participle. And if you want to say something that is not available, then you have to use context to push the reader in that direction and break the rules, basically. But the fact that the rules are sometimes broken, though, doesn't mean the rules don't exist. And you can see that in all of grammar, right? I mean, sometimes context allows rules to be broken, and still you have 30. Yes?
You can't break a rule unless you do have rules.
You can't break a rule unless you have a rule. Is that what you said? Yeah. So that's why they say this is the exception that proves the rule, because you can't have an exception without a rule.
In relation to that, in the Great Commission, in that participial phrase, is that an aorist participle or a present participle? Go
I think I know, but I wouldn't want to say without looking. There are a couple of texts we can look at.
We turned it into like more like an imperative, like
Yeah.
a participle,
As you were going.
present participle.
Yeah. Well, when we get to our reading, there are a couple of texts I want to look at. So when we pull out our Bibles, we'll take a look at that. But Joe can tell us in a moment what kind of participle it is.
Paruthentes. It is a aorist, a passive one, masculine nominative plural. As you were going.
Maybe you're right.
Goldstone.
Huh?
I give you Goldstone.
Oh, cool.
But would that be contemporaneous action or antecedent action? If it's aorist, it would be after going, make disciples. But the reason sometimes people translate it as you were going is because they believe, and I think they have a point. They believe that that text is assuming that you're going to go somewhere, right?
Or as you have been going with me, be speaking to them. Be disciples.
I'm not sure that that's what that means, but we tend to put the emphasis sometimes, we tend to put the emphasis sometimes on the go part, right?
Oh, yeah.
And maybe that's not where the emphasis should be, unless you're recruiting missionaries.
Plus 2/3 of God is
So
go.
we've all heard the missionary.
There's a good hermeneutical principle.
Yeah, we've all heard the great missionary recruitment tools, haven't we? 2/3 of God is go. And if you saw 10 men carrying a log and there were 9 on one side and 1 on the other, which side would you help? That kind of thing. Well, I'm not sure that ministry is like a log.
Develop that a little bit.
Well, in any case, I did ask a missionary one time in one of my college classes, using all of this stuff, trying to guilt us who are not planning to be missionaries into being missionaries. And I said to him, how many churches do you think it takes to support one missionary? And I don't remember the number he gave, but I think it was more than 10. So it seems to me you ought to have at least 10 pastors for every one missionary, it seems to me, if you look at it that way. I mean, if you want to be supported as a missionary. Right? Well, anyway, I digress. So we understand participles and time in respect to the main verb. Aspect basically is very similar to as we have seen it with the other tenses, or tenses in the indicative, I should say, when we studied tense before. So here again, we have a chart. Remember that the charts in this book are worth the price of the book by themselves. Top of page 269. We have both independent and dependent uses of participles. Again, most of the verbal uses of participles are going to be dependent. The adjectival uses of the participle could be either. So, having mentioned adjectival uses of the participle, we will look at that by turning the page to 70. The adjectival use of the participle proper. Participle simply modifying a substantive or something used as a substantive. So we have the shining star, the living water. Fairly straightforward. Attributive participles, predicate participles. The Word of God is living. So in that case, it functions as a predicate adjective, doesn't it? So it's either functioning as an adjective modifying a noun or a predicate adjective in an equative sentence. All right. Now, substantival uses of the participle. Again, that's a participle used as if it were a noun. Remember the rule: if a participle has an article with it, it must be in the adjectival side of the categories of uses. It doesn't have to have an article to be an adjectival participle, but if it has an article, it must be an adjectival participle. So all adjectival participles do not have articles, but all articular participles are adjectival. Now that requires a little logic, doesn't it? So there's a logic lesson for it. All right? So you may just be using a participle like a substantive, and chances are you're going to have an article with it. Everyone believing, or everyone who believes, would be an example. All right? So that's fairly straightforward. A lot of them out there, but the usage is not complicated. Verbal participles, this is where it gets a little bit more complicated. You have dependent verbal participles, and that's going to be most of them, isn't it? And so you have adverbial participles. Now, what's that mean? They're going to be acting like an adverb. And so in this category, you have temporal participles. So you might translate it while doing this, or after doing this, or before doing this, or having done this, blah, 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 whatever the main verb is. That's fairly straightforward. Now, here's another chart that's interesting on page 273. If you have a perfect or aorist participle, now we're going to look at other uses, other adverbial uses, besides just the straightforward temporal. Does he say that that's an abused category? I don't know, but you could, it's kind of like in the genitive of description. Most genitives are genitives of description, but you can describe it. You can describe a genitive more narrowly than that, oftentimes. Same thing with the participles here. You can say, well, that's a temporal, but you can describe it more narrowly than just a temporal participle. So the antecedent participles, perfect and aorist participles, typically. And here's how they can be used: cause, condition, and concession. So this is going to help us and narrow us down, because if we have a future participle, we're not going to call it a cause, condition, or concession use of an adverbial participle. See? Now, sometimes a present participle can have that usage, but not so often, right? A present participle will probably be means, manner, or result. Sometimes an antecedent participle can be means or manner, but not so often. And sometimes a subsequent participle can be result, but less often. A subsequent participle, future, sometimes present. And why would it be sometimes present? Because I want to indicate that it's a subsequent action, but it's durative in nature or something like that, right? At least it has a present kind of aspect. And so the purpose participle will be a subsequent, typically participle, sometimes contemporary or contemporaneous action. Okay? So that chart is a good one to kind of take a look at and note. All right, so top of page 274, after the temporal participle, we have the participle of manner, by whatever. He went away grieving. Now he says that the participle indicates the manner in which the action of the finite verb is carried out. There is much confusion between this participle and the participle of means. The reason is that both answer the question how. But beyond this initial question, there is usually little similarity. The participle of manner is relatively rare in comparison with the participle of mean. Second, pragmatically, the participle of manner refers to the emotion or sometimes attitude that accompanies the main verb. So that's rather important to be aware of at that point. So he went away grieving. What's the manner in which he went away? Well, grieving is an emotion, isn't it? They went on their way rejoicing. Then the participle of means, which has its similarities but differences, as we've said, is the means by which something happens. So I have sinned, betraying innocent blood, literally, right? I have sinned betraying innocent blood. I have sinned by betraying innocent blood. So there's an aorist participle used as a participle of means. By what means did you sin? By betraying innocent blood. Or Saul confounded the Jews by proving that Jesus was the Christ. Saul confounded the Jews, proving that this one is the Christ. So what kind of participle is that? Well, that is how he confounded the Jews, by proving. Now, it's not an emotion or attitude, so it's not the manner in which he confounded them, but it's the means by which he confounded them. Make sense? Humble yourselves under the mighty hand of God by casting all your cares on him, because he cares for you. A lot of great exegetical gems and a lot of great understanding of a scriptural passage comes from making a determination of how the participle, how the adverbial participle is being used. Don't you think that preaches? Humble yourself under the mighty hand of God by casting all your cares upon him, because he cares for you. Now, how do I humble myself to God? Well, by casting my cares upon him. Right? So, a couple of questions. What does it mean if I don't cast my cares upon God? It could be an indication that I'm arrogant or prideful or unwilling to humble myself before God. And maybe that is because I think I might not like the way God's going to make it come out. I know better than God what would be good for me. I mean, this preaches so well I can hardly not preach it right now, right? I know better than God what's good for me, and I'm worried that God is going to get it wrong and make it come out this way, and I want it this way. And, I'm not going to submit myself to God and realize that he is in control and it's going to be okay. So there could be other reasons why I don't cast my cares upon God, but it could be that it's arrogance. But when I do cast my cares upon God, that's an indication that I am humble before God, that I have humbled myself under the mighty hand of God. Now, how does the mighty hand of God come into that? Is God able to act on my behalf? He certainly is all-powerful and able to do that. So if I stand before an all-powerful God, what is the reasonable response? To humble myself before an all-powerful God, because, to go up against God is pretty stupid, right? Come on, God, stand in a ring with me. Job tried that, right? And got put in his place. But also, if God is all-powerful, and I humble myself before him, then he's able to take care of my needs. So just by understanding that participle as a participle of means, I'm doing my little exegesis thing, right? And I go, what kind of participle is that? What's a participle of means? All of a sudden, in the matter of 5 minutes, my whole sermon just blossoms in front of me. Okay? And now, I might have to make it rhyme or alliterate it, if that's your thing, right? But now, boom, just the sermon just blossomed. And I have to hold still for a little bit so that it sinks in and I don't start writing and lose it all, right? All of a sudden now, I know where we're going here, and it becomes very applicational, doesn't it? Yes?
It seems like somebody could argue, though, that this was manner. And I don't know how would you defend either one, because you could say,
well, if it's manner,
it doesn't talk about an emotion, like it talks about usually manner is an emotion, but I don't know if manner always has to be an emotion.
well, it doesn't make sense so much if the manner in which I'm to humble myself, first of all, is an action. But casting my cares upon God is descriptive of my state of mind when I humble myself. I mean, there is some similarity, but when I take it as a means, humble myself by, the passage just opens up. But if I take it as the manner, my attitude, my emotion, or whatever, when you're humbling yourself before God, be casting your cares upon him. Boy, it just doesn't
Well, I
sing.
agree. I like the by means, but I just noticed NAS does the same thing. They say
they do?
They just say casting all your anxiety by, they don't say bypassing, they just say casting.
Well, actually, that's part of what I like about the New American Standard, in a sense, is that it, and this is an interpretive issue, isn't it?
Right.
But part of what I like about the New American Standard is it leaves the interpreting to me. Right? And part of what a translation like the NIV does, to make it more clear and to make it easier reading, it interprets for you, which is great until you don't agree with the interpretation. So, I'm reading my Greek text and I have a participle. Well, in that participle by itself, its usage, my answer is not in the usage of the participle in the participle by itself. My answer to the usage of that participle is in the context. And in the New American Standard, it's the same. They don't answer that for me. They just give me the context that would answer it for me. Right? Remember, good exegesis depends on asking good questions of the text. That's what you're doing. You're able to ask the right questions and good questions of the text. And if you can answer those questions, then you've got something going. All right, so participle of means. Participle of cause, because, of course, answers the question why. So Joseph, being a righteous man, wanted to put her away privately. I think that's how the rest of that goes. Joseph, because he was a righteous man, it gives a reason, doesn't it? The reason for his action. Because Jesus was wearied, he sat. That's fairly straightforward as well. And then there's a participle of condition. For example, this example, whatever you ask for in prayer, if you believe, you will receive it. So, whatever you ask for in prayer, believing, you will receive. So, believing then becomes a condition. Now, you could say, well, what about means? Whatever you ask for in prayer, by believing. But that's awkward. Ask the question, do you pray by believing? Or is that a manner in which you pray? Now, you could say that's a participle of manner. The manner in which I pray is in the manner of believing. Well, you could probably make that argument. But it really means the same thing, and what you're getting at is if you believe, if you pray, when you pray, if you believe, you will receive it. So it's a little bit more straightforward, I think, to call it a participle of condition. An adverbial participle of condition. Now here in Hebrews 6, 4-6, you might like us to look at this paragraph later because it's interesting. It says, it is impossible for the one or ones once for all enlightened. It is impossible for those once for all enlightened and falling away again to be renewed unto repentance. And he's saying this is a conditional participle, so it is impossible to restore again to repentance those who have once been enlightened if they fall away. I think that's perfectly reasonable. He says this participle, parapesontos, is often construed as conditional, a tradition found in the King James Version and repeated in most modern translations and for many commentators, but see the NET. This is unwarranted. So I'd like to go back, I haven't done it, I'd like to go back and read his discussion of this in his larger version of this book. Be kind of interesting. I wanted to do it, I didn't have time today. All right, participles of concession. Although is used in every one of his examples to translate it. That's kind of a good marker when you can translate it that way. You being dead in your transgressions, so although you were dead, right? So we're giving a circumstance of a situation, you being dead, but you can use although to translate it, so participle of concession. although you have not seen him, you love him. So, whom not seeing, you love. Although you did not see him, you love. So that's fairly straightforward, isn't it? And then purpose, or the telic, you see that word telic. And where do they get telic? From the Greek word teleao, right? Complete, mature, perfect. So purpose, purpose participle. Examples, if Elijah is going to come, saving him, or the purpose of saving him. Now he said this to signify by what sort of death he would die. He said this signifying what sort of death he was about to die. For the purpose of signifying, right? He sent him for the purpose of blessing you. He sent him blessing you. Obviously answers the question, why did he send him? So here we have purpose and result again, and those are hard to distinguish, just like they are in the infinitive, they are in the participle. Even in the previous one, he sent him for the purpose of blessing you, or he sent him with the result that you're blessed. Sometimes it's not exactly clear. And he indicates this in this chart, again, top of page 279, purpose and result. It's kind of interesting. There can be intention without accomplishment. So we can have a purpose, participle, I suppose, in infinitive too, that indicates a purpose or an intention, even though the intention was not accomplished, so there is no result. You can have an intention with accomplishment, so that you have purpose and result. You could have accomplishment that was intended, and see how that's just backward. So the result part is emphasized, right? Accomplishment that was intended, so you have a result that flows from a purpose. But then you have accomplishment without intention. See, so really there's a continuum here, isn't there? So you can have and that's why purpose and result are hard to distinguish sometimes, and they're very similar. Is it intention with accomplishment, or accomplishment that was intended? And it's just a difference in emphasis, isn't it? Right? And sometimes I don't even think you can really determine which is emphasized over the other, and you just have to say you have both, purpose and result. But if you can decide that intention is emphasized, then it's a purpose. If you can decide that accomplishment is emphasized, then it's a result participle. So we have the semantic overlap of purpose and result participles. Honey, what did you study tonight? We studied the semantic overlap of purpose and result participles. But you have to let them know you're getting your money's worth.
True.
All right, so here's a result participle. He taught in their synagogues with the result that he was being glorified by all. So literally, he taught in their synagogues being glorified by all. So really, in Greek, you see a participle, and but in the participle itself, you don't have any indication of its usage, being glorified. But you got to look at the context. Okay, how is this participle? He taught in the synagogues being glorified. Is it because he was being glorified by all? I mean, in the broader context, I suppose that's possible. Is it the manner? Is it the means? Is it the purpose? For the purpose of being glorified, or the result of his teaching is being glorified by all? So those are exegetical questions, and those are not always entirely clear, right? So you have to make a judgment call at that point. And your judgments will get better as you have experience in the text and experience asking that question. Right? So for now, let me encourage you not to decide to change or challenge any major cardinal doctrines of Christianity based on your decision of the use of a participle in a Greek text. Okay? But get some practice. All right. It's useful to back up and look at where we're at in the outline. We're looking at verbal participles, page 271, dependent verbal participles, adverbial dependent verbal participles. You don't have to say all this, when you're exegeting or something like that. Adverbial, now we're on to attendant circumstances. So these are verbial participles, dependent adverbial participles, attendant circumstances. All right. Definition. The attendant circumstance participle is used to communicate an action that in some sense is coordinate with the finite verb. In this respect, it is not dependent, for it is translated like a verb. Yet it is still dependent semantically because it cannot exist without the main verb. It is translated as a finite verb, that's important to note, connected to the main verb by and. The participle then, in effect, piggybacks on the mood of the main verb. This usage is relatively common but widely misunderstood. All right. Here's an imperative. Sit down quickly, writing 50, literally. Sit down quickly and write 50. Rise, Peter, and kill and eat. That's my life verse. Did you know that? Kill and eat. So that means I get to hunt and eat. Well, I'm teasing about that being my life verse, but it's a good one, isn't it?
Means we can eat it.
Well, anything you want to, I guess.
Oh, yeah.
Is that what they used when they installed you as pastor?
Yeah.
The charge to the pastor?
Rise, Peter. Kill and eat.
Kill and eat.
In my church, that's appropriate, actually. I caught a sturgeon Saturday. Just chopped it up into steaks today.
How big was it?
49 inches. We also cut a 61-incher. That hurt to throw back. Yeah. That was a nice fish, that 61-incher. Should have caught that last year.
What's the maximum size?
42 to 60.
I just missed it.
I know, that was tough. We measured it 4 or 5 times, too. Yeah, no. Cut the tail off.
Yeah.
Wouldn't that be a bummer if one came with the end of its tail cut off and it was like 58 or 59? What would you do? I guess if it were healed, I guess you could keep it. All right, so attendant circumstances. Hopefully that makes sense to you. Oh, look, here's our verse, Matthew 28, 19 and 20. He's saying that this participle is attendant circumstances. Go therefore and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father, and Son, and Holy Spirit. So, go and make disciples. I don't know. I guess that's debatable. Well, he says on the next page, although many argue against paruthentes being an attendant circumstance participle, it clearly has that force. Maybe not so clearly. The trailing participles, baptizing and teaching, should be taken as indicating means. And that would be true. I agree with that.
Is that true because you agree with it?
It's true, therefore I agree with it. It's just, an ability to recognize what's true that's important. Yeah, I don't know. The point is, I think the main point that he may be making here is that this participle go is not parallel to the other participles, baptizing and teaching. Okay? You don't really have 3 parallel participles, you have 2 parallel participles, by baptizing and by teaching.
Yeah, that's how you make disciples. That's not how you go.
That's how you make disciples. Yeah. So those second, third, the second and third participle have a different relationship to make disciples than the go participle has. There's a different relationship, and you can see that in the word order. It's very clear.
This is a little aside, but did you hear about that pastor in Texas?
I don't know.
Yesterday, with a baptism service,
Oh, yeah.
and the microphone, I guess, fell into the water, and he was electrocuted. And left a wife and 3 small kids, a little 5-year-old daughter and 3-year-old twin boys.
You're kidding? From a microphone?
Yeah.
I never knew there was that much juice in a microphone.
Wow.
Well, that's pretty sad.
Huh?
Cordless.
Yeah, I was just going to say, the moral of that story is use a cordless mic.
Is this the password?
Yeah.
Yeah. 33.
You're kidding.
We just get started.
I'm glad we just bought a new working cordless handheld mic, because that's, if you're going to use a regular mic, you could use a cordless handheld. And that wouldn't kill you.
I don't touch anything when I'm in the water.
Yeah.
I don't take any chances.
That's scary. I just took a ladder off of my roof and was very stupid and leaned it down, and I was stopped by the electrical wires coming from my house.
Oh.
I could have died. However, it was a fiberglass ladder with aluminum rungs, you know, so yeah. But that was kind of scary to think about. Home alone on a Monday. You know, in the rain.
Yeah.
Standing on a wet sidewalk. Wow. So there's a lesson that's not a Greek lesson, but a good one nonetheless. Use cordless mics when you're baptizing. Good, we got that on tape. All right then. Where are we here? Let's see. All right. Attendant. Look. What do we say? Attendant circumstances. Indirect discourse. This, I think, is similar to the infinitive. As you can see, when Jacob heard that there was grain in Egypt, when after Jacob heard grain being in Egypt, right? That's indirect discourse. He heard there is grain in Egypt, right? So it's very similar to the infinitive in that usage. And then the usage of the participle that we've grown to know and love, the periphrastic use of the participle, where you have a form of an equative verb, particularly a, me, and the participle working together to form a verbal unit. And so again, he gives a chart on top of page 282, and shows that you could have the finite verb of a, me in the present tense plus a present participle to give a finite tense equivalent of the present. It could be that authors change what they do or pick the various things sometimes so as not to be boring. Keep that in mind. Authors vary the way they say things just to vary the style and keep the reader interested. So there may not be huge exegetical significance in every little change of wording or grammar. However, I suspect that it could be possible that an author would use a present of a, me and a present participle in a periphrastic relationship to doubly emphasize the derivative nature of the action. Because you can use a present tense, and there it is, from the present tense. But if you're using two present tenses together, it could just be, because that's the style I like, right? I just feel like doing that right here. It could have significance exegetically. You look at the context and see what you think. Imperfect plus the present, so you get an imperfect kind of tense equivalent. But again, it could be to emphasize the derivative nature. Here, the future of a, me plus a present participle gives you a future tense equivalent, but I would add that it's a future tense equivalent in terms of the time, but in terms of the aspect that's derivative. So that is how you could indicate a future action with a derivative aspect. Because just a plain old future is going to give you an heuristic kind of aspect. So in that case, you come up with a result that you can't get without using a periphrastic. I mean, you can get it if the context pushes a future to be a derivative action, but I mean to actually state it unequivocally in the text, the only way you can is state a future action that has a derivative aspect is with a periphrastic, using a future of a, me and a present participle. Same thing with the present and perfect, or a similar thing at least, and you see this in Ephesians 2, verse 8. The present of a, me and the perfect participle probably emphasizes the the result, the present duration of the result of the action of the perfect participle.
I'm sorry.
Is that a heater?
Yeah.
No? Yeah, it's hot. And then you have the imperfect plus the perfect, and that gives you a pluperfect result. But I would probably guess, since you could use a pluperfect, that maybe you're emphasizing that the original action may have been derivative in its aspect. See what I mean? Does that make sense to you? Perfect participle, imperfect of me. Maybe you're saying, you're probably emphasizing the original action and calling it derivative in its aspect. So you're maybe indicating some things that just the plain old verb would not indicate. Here it is, in the example Ephesians 2:8. For by grace you have been saved, or you are saved. I think, for by grace you stand saved. I think it emphasizes the results of our salvation. We were saved and we remain saved. And I think that's emphasizing that remain saved. So that it is true, and I think this verse teaches, but doesn't emphasize, that you enter into salvation by grace. What this verse emphasizes is that you not only enter into salvation by grace, but you stay saved by grace. So what does that say about your ability to lose salvation? See? And if you stay saved by grace, how much more do you enter into salvation by grace? See? So I think that's an exegetically very important way to do it. Because you could have just used a perfect of sozo, couldn't you? You have been saved, or you are saved, or you were saved, or whatever. You know, I mean, there are lots of ways you could have said it. But here, he uses a perfect participle with the present form of a me. And I think that emphasizes the result. All right?
Well, throughout, I was just in that passage yesterday, and up through there, he uses mostly aorist tense, but in verse 5 and in verse 8, he repeats that phrase, and he uses the perfect there.
Mm-hmm.
So it's probably emphasizing the result.
I think so.
That preaches. That preaches.
That preaches.
In fact, I preached it yesterday.
See, there you, did you say that? Right on. See? Great.
Yeah, I was right there with checking them all.
Hey, you checking him, and
Amen,
you
brother.
see, I'm telling you, solid Bible teaching. Don't you love it? It's great to have pastors who teach, solid stuff. Makes it all worth it.
Isn't that true of a father-son relationship? If we truly have been born of God, whether it's the same seed, spiritual seed that was placed in the womb of Mary, I mean, there was definitely grace that conceived us, and we became not necessarily biologically half brothers with Christ, but we became born again new creatures, sons, let's say, so that a son is always going to be a son of his father. There's nothing that you can do to undo that sonship biologically. I mean, and if it's a good father that the son has, then if the son does worse, his love increases, or grace becomes more needed for that son, and so he stays, he remains in the Father's grace, even all the more, even though he may be continuing in a bad way.
Yeah, that's right. Well, I think it's very important to realize that not only are we justified by grace, that we are sanctified by grace. And I don't earn my sanctification any more than I earn my justification. But my sanctification takes a response from me just as much as my justification requires a response from me. Now, where those meet, that's a little high for me and a little bit in the fog, in the clouds, right? But they are true, I think, both of them. Both of those are true. I don't know that we spend a lot of time teaching that we're sanctified by grace. But the New Testament is full of commands, isn't it? We ought to do this, we ought to do that. How do you deal with that?
Well, I think you have to deal with it, and I personally think that is part of practical sanctification.
Yeah.
The good news is, at least the way I understand it is, no matter how much we accomplish, as it were, in obedience to those imperatives of the New Testament, by God's grace, we still will be glorified.
Mm-hmm.
But inasmuch as He's given me commands, 2 Corinthians 7:1, therefore, having these promises, let us cleanse ourselves from all the... This is us. This is something I have to do.
That's right.
Part of working out my salvation.
Yeah.
What that has a bearing on, in my understanding, is going to be our future standing in the kingdom, or the rewards that we receive or don't receive. But the good news, I think, for us is by His grace, we will all become like Christ.
That's right. But even that is a response to God. It's not like I have to muster up the strength to be sanctified or to do good. I simply have to respond to God and obey. See, just as God makes the initial choice and the initial move for my justification, I think God makes the initial choice and the initial move for my sanctification.
Absolutely. But you just said it. I have to obey.
But I still have to obey.
And
I have to have
and
faith.
that takes effort.
I have
Make
to
every effort to add to your faith.
Absolutely. I have to have faith, and I have to make a decision to be saved. But that faith is a gift of God. I have to have faith and make a decision to be sanctified. But that faith is a gift of God. So there is a divine-human cooperation thing happening. And how that all works together, I'm not quite sure. But I do know that God's work is prior to mine. And that there is work that I have to do. But at the end of the day, that's in response to God, not, trying to create a response in God. So I'm not earning sanctification. I am simply receiving that gift as well as I receive my justification. But I can also choose not to receive that gift so well, or at all. Well, maybe not at all, but some at least, right? So there are choices. So, the whole sovereignty of God, response of humanity is tough up in here, right?
How does Philippians 2:12 and 13 help with that? Because in 12, because we just went through this, in 12 it's kind of God's mind as far as what we're doing, accomplishments, human accomplishments. But in 13, it's an ergo, which is more of it's a totally different word.
Well,
so it's not God
work out your own
doing-
salvation with fear and trembling, for it is God who is at work in you, right?
See, I think that English totally loses the whole point because we translate work both places.
Well, yeah,
and
and
you
that's,
can do that, sure, but you lose because in Greek it's two totally different words.
it is. But my point was that even though he says, work out, or however you want to translate that, work out your own salvation with fear and trembling, he immediately goes on to, but it is God who is at work in you.
Right.
And again, he's getting at that dual thing. It's like a triangle, right? And you can't deny either side of the triangle, but the tip is kind of higher than we can see clearly, right? But we know some things about each, right?
And he just gets that section right before that. Just talks about, the example of Christ humbling himself and becoming
Yeah.
obedient.
Yeah.
And then it says, "So work out your salvation, for it's God who works in you." Yeah, it's kind of.
It's interesting because I just did a study of that word katergazo because I preached that passage not too long ago, and it means, I looked at it outside the Bible and stuff, and it basically means to accomplish something.
Right.
Now, if you take it in its constituent parts, to work down or work according to, it was tempting to say, well, work according to your salvation. But that's separating in a way that's probably unnatural to the language, and that doesn't seem to be how it's used ever.
So why
In the
didn't you use
literature.
the same word in 13?
Well,
that's my big question.
Because 13 sounds more like God is gonna,
Well,
God
it does-
energizes you, He gives you the ability,
Right,
He
the
gives you the
energy.
Well,
power.
the English translation does not translate those, to my knowledge, if I remember correctly, the same. One is work out your own salvation. The other one is that God is at work
At work.
in you.
Yeah, but it's still work. I mean,
Well,
use
both
the
of
same
them.
word,
I know, but listen, kat ergodzamon and en, what is it? En ergodzamon?
And ergo.
En ergo, but from the same root. Right?
Work out what God has worked in. And that's
Yeah.
essentially what He's saying, and I think you can't get away from, I don't think we can get away from our responsibility to do that.
But, yeah, and I want to ask, what does salvation mean in that context too? Is it salvation, is it justification, or what is it? That's not an easy passage. But it's good for us to be pushed, especially good for us Calvinists to be pushed to the point of, my response is necessary and it matters. And from my perspective, it looks and feels like I'm doing some initiating. And certainly my decision matters. From a broader perspective, it's God who initiated first, but I'm not always aware of that. All right, so we have the redundant participle, bottom of page 282. We see that all over in the book of Mark, right? A verb of saying or sometimes thinking can be used with a participle with basically the same meaning. So he answered and said, right? So that's just kind of a stylistic thing. The construction apokrythes, apen, became to such an extent an empty formula that it is even sometimes used when there is nothing preceding to which an answer can be referred. We see that all over Mark, and it's in the Gospels, right? So those were the dependent uses of the participle, the verbal participle. Now we have independent verbal participles, fairly rare, imperatival, right? Hating evil, clinging to what is good. Well, obviously that's a command. Hate evil, cling to what is good. Servants, submit yourselves to your masters. Right? Then you have the participle absolute, the nominative absolute, and he's really saying this is really a pendant nominative. It's kind of similar to a genitive absolute, but it really is a noun or a participle, a nominative participle that becomes kind of the subject of the sentence, but not grammatically, or the topic of the sentence. So, the one believing in me, rivers from his belly will flow. Rivers will flow out of his belly. So that's kind of how that one works. Then the genitive absolute, which we're familiar with, or at least I hope you are, because you had a translator for in our passage, and you have before in Mark, right? Participle in the genitive, usually a pronoun in the genitive case. And they function as grammatically independent or not connected to the sentence, but logically connected. So while he was saying these things, a certain ruler came and bowed down before him. And he says this next example in Romans is rare because not very often do you see a genitive absolute in the epistle. So, while her husband is still alive, she becomes another man's wife. And that completes the participle. And we will take a break, and then we will come back and read a little bit.